What is discussed on this program is meant to be for general information and educational purposes. It is not intended to be legal advice and should not be used for that purpose. If you have legal matters you need help with, then you need to seek the advice of an attorney.
Welcome to another episode of Legal Briefs, an educational program discussing various legal topics brought to you by the law firm of Boston, Bever, Klinge, Cross, and Chidester in conjunction with WCTV. I'm Bob Bever, a partner with BBKCC, and today's topic is working your way through city laws, rules, and regulations, or a how-to guide understanding city government. Joining us today is, most appropriately, the person who is ultimately in charge of enforcing any city laws or rules, my partner, A.J. Sickman, the city attorney for the city of Richmond. Welcome, A.J.
Thanks, Bob. Happy to be here.
Hey, glad to have you here. Now, I know everyone refers to you as city attorney. Is that technically correct? Or describe your position, how you got appointed and how you got to be where you are.
Yeah, so technically the answer is no. If you look at state statute, it describes my title as that of corporation counsel, not city attorney. But that's what we use in everyday language and lingo about the office and within the city, but technically it is corporation counsel. How I got to the position that I'm in directly relates to the mayor. So by statute, he has the ability to choose whom he wants to fill and serve in that position. So the current mayor, Dave Snow, appointed me to this position in 2017, and then ultimately my contract needs to be approved by the Board of Works, and we do that annually.
Okay. So I kind of know a little bit, having been there many years ago, being under the administration of Dennis Andrews and Shelley Miller. So I think it might be helpful for the two of us talking about some of these. And I know some things change, some things stay the same.
Sure.
So while we don't have time to go into every detail of the city code, some questions that we hope to address in this show will include, when do I need to get a permit, whether it be a building permit or for my dog or for solicitation, fireworks? How do I get property rezoned? What happens if I'm cited for a city code violation, or can I initiate a city code violation against my neighbor? Are there limits what I can do in the front street of my house? How do I get a new house hooked up to city sewer? Some of these and other questions we hope to address. Now, AJ, you may recall from law school where exams, a professor will set out a factual example of a situation that one needs to look at, the ramifications of the situation. And I thought in going through some of our questions today, it might be helpful to set out such a scenario to better understand the local issues. In talking to my wife earlier, my wife wanted to make sure that everybody understood this is not me personally, this is our example. So I've just moved into Richmond. I bought a house, and I have the following things going on in my life. House needs some remodeling, that I'm going to raise the ceilings in a couple rooms, install a new furnace. There's a lot of stuff in the house I want to remove through a large dumpster, so I need to secure that from someplace. I've noticed that my neighbor's house is painted a very ugly shade of pink and has some storm shutters that have fallen off. They're sitting on the ground. My own job's going to open up a new pet store downtown. My wife wants to open up a beauty parlor in the lower level of our home. I want to plant a couple new trees in the area between the street and my sidewalk out front. My son loves to skateboard and plans on doing that in our peaceful street in front of the house. I'm a gun enthusiast, so I'm planning on setting up a target range in my backyard. I also own a classic 55 Corvette. It currently doesn't run, but I'm working on it, and for now, the only place I have to store it's on the street in front of the house. I have a nice collie dog, Siamese cat. And finally, to celebrate my move to Richmond, I've invited a number of family members from around the state. We were going to have a picnic out on Roosevelt Hill at Glen Miller, and we'll bring a cooler of beer and maybe shoot off some fireworks to celebrate. So, AJ, does this guy need to be concerned with any local laws or rules?
Well, as we talked about before we actually came on the show today, I think there's a couple of answers here.
First, you said just have him not to move to Richmond.
There's some nice properties across the state line in Ohio. If you want to, no, we have a lot to unpack with this, obviously. Okay. Yeah, I think he has some concerns.
Okay, let's start first. Building permits or installation permits. What do we see with this guy and in general that's going to be needed?
Well, pursuant to your fact pattern, he wants to do a few things. He has some remodeling that he wants to do. He
Yep.
wants to, I think you referenced the ceiling remodel.
Right.
We got a furnace that you talked about.
Right.
So what you can't do, and I think most people generally understand this, is just start remodeling your home and making major changes to it without
I think the law,
securing-
$500 or more is
Right.
the threshold for needing that building
for
permit.
needing that building permit. And that includes the demolition of any building, moving a structure, also includes putting in a swimming pool. And we talk about
Okay.
things like improvement permits, which I know we'll get into in a little bit with the furnace. So
Well, actually,
plumbing-
installation permit, if they're going to
Installation,
install
right.
something.
Well, that would be the installation permit,
HVAC or furnace. So he's going to need to be doing that as well as getting that building permit, going through the city. Now, is there a procedure at the city government that, how does that initiate it?
Well, you would start with the Department of Infrastructure and Development. So they have a staff that is very adept in working through these issues and helping people understand what they may need or what they may not need. When these issues come to me, I'm always happy to work with people through the process, but usually the first thing that I tell people is if you get on the city's website, and I actually wrote down this website, it's richmondindiana.gov/resources/permit/applications, and that will walk you through some of the criteria so you can check the boxes and determine what you may need or what you may not need and get organized before you ever come to the city building.
Okay. Zoning, opening up this beauty parlor downstairs. I'm assuming it's not already zoned in this residential neighborhood. So what's going to happen here? And let's talk to the public about the difference between rezoning and requesting a variance.
Right, so there are different options available to this person. Without getting too far down into the weeds, we have in place what we call the UDO, or the Unified Development Ordinance. That sets forth 22 different zoning districts. So as you're aware, in certain districts you can do and not do certain things. Now, if this person lives in a residential district that isn't zoned to operate this business out of the house, she'll have a couple of options to her. One is to seek rezoning, and the other would be to seek a variance. And I know you and I recently were involved in some variance issues that we
Yes.
worked through together. So that process, kind of leading into that, goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
And that's actually a one-step process just to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
That's
as
correct.
compared to a complete rezoning going through Plan Commission first, they make a recommendation, then going to City Council.
Correct.
So maybe a little easier in that respect, though with the variance, that you have to meet some criteria for that variance, don't you?
For the variance, you would. So the Board of Zoning Appeals would hold a hearing, and interested parties would receive notice of that hearing. They have the opportunity to come talk about their position on that variance request. If the Board of Zoning Appeals is to grant that variance request, then they have to make certain findings of fact. So it has to be consistent with the comprehensive master plan. It can't be injurious to the public health, safety, or welfare, et cetera. So they have to make those findings in order to provide that variance. Now, and I think it's important to note that that variance would only apply to that property owner. So in your example, the person that wants to operate the beauty salon out of the basement or the house, wherever it is, that is unique to her. Or
She
him.
moves out, that would go away.
Correct.
It's not a permanent item with the property that would be like in the rezoning.
That's correct.
Also, with the variance, they can put all sorts of conditions on it,
They can.
whether it be a buffer with new trees along the side yard if it's something that might be objectionable to a neighbor. So they actually have more, I think, flexibility in those kind of things than the rezoning, which is just yay or nay.
Correct. And the rezoning, as you talked about the process generally, is a little bit more cumbersome because it is yay or nay, and then it also applies in perpetuity unless that is changed again in the future. So we do things like send it to what we call tech review, Plan Commission takes it to Council, Council looks at that through a 3-reading process, it comes back to the Plan Commission for a recommendation, and then ultimately that would come back to Council to approve or deny that zoning change through that 3-reading process.
Okay. All right. How about the neighbor's house? His color just, I think, is horrid and poor taste. Can you do anything about it?
Well, maybe is the answer. If we look at our ordinances, they require that the exterior of all premises be maintained so that the appearance reflects a level of maintenance in keeping with the standards of the city, and so as to avoid blighting effects and hazards to health, safety, and welfare. So that's pretty general, sweeping language. When I look at that language as a city attorney, if you came to me in this example and said, I really don't like the pink color, I don't think we're triggering that language.
Well, I think, and that's what I found both in the towns that I represent. I think people sometimes, unfortunately, have a misconception that we can make the neighborhood look like I want it to look, and you really can't control that on a neighbor's house. You've got to get to the point of either meeting these standards or the unsafe building standard, whereby it's created a hazard, nuisance of some sort.
Right. And I think in your example, you also referenced maybe the shutters were coming off, or
Right.
if we have broken glass and that type of thing. That starts to change the
Then
analysis
it
a
does.
little bit.
Okay. I know I'm going to open opened up the pet store, there are just certain things that, even though certain occupations require state permitting, some things actually require a city permit as well, don't they, to
Correct.
open up? And that would include the pet shop, any place that you have it, even if it's zoned properly.
Right. Anywhere within the corporate limits of the city of Richmond, you would need to secure a permit to operate that pet shop.
Okay. The trees that I want to put in, can I just go out and take down the trees that I want in that area between the street and the sidewalk, or do I have to be concerned with anything?
No, you can't. So we're looking at an area that we refer to as the right-of-way. So in between the sidewalk and the street. That particular area of land in front of the guy's house, in your example, he can't just go out and decide that I'm going to plant trees, or maybe there are trees out there that he doesn't like and I'm just going to take those down. We have an ordinance that does address that.
You need permission from the city to either remove what's there or put in new. However, the city, though, they do have the ability, even if it's a tree that you've put in, they're allowed to come through and do some trimming of it if it's for safety purposes, or even remove it if it's for safety purposes.
That's correct.
Okay. Animals. I've got my dog, I've got my cat. Can I just live with them, or do I need to do anything with them?
Well, we actually do have a licensing procedure in place to get tags for your animals. So there's a fee associated with that, and I'm guessing there's a lot of people that if you didn't look into this or have some prior experience, you may not know that.
I would bet a lot don't.
Right. So that is in place through city ordinance.
And likewise to show a rabies vaccine that we have. And of course, I can't let them run at large. Those you do enforce, I think, regularly, at least attempt to when people are coming in. Loud barking, of course, cannot be vicious. Use of the streets. Do I have carte blanche for my son to go out and use a skateboard on the street in front of my house?
No, you don't. And obviously, an 8-year-old kid may not be thinking about that and thinks it's perfectly fine to go out into a street and skateboard or roller skate or whatever the case may be. But in your example, there exists in our books an ordinance that prevents someone from doing just that on public streets. You can cross the street through a crosswalk, but that's about as far as it goes, unless that street has the designation, what we call a play street. And those would be an area where typically cars aren't permitted to travel unless they're just doing it in order to get home. And in that instance, and there's appropriate signage, then you could. But for the vast majority of cases, the answer would be no.
I think that you might see where somebody's going to have a block party on a weekend on the summertime, and they want to shut off the street, get a play date, but that has to, again, get a process through the city to be approved.
There would be prior approval associated with that.
For
yes.
that. My car, can I just park that car that's been still being worked on my street?
I'll tell you, this
Is that
guy
another
is a real
no?
nightmare to me. Unfortunately, it is, and I think for good reason, right? So you can't leave an abandoned vehicle that's inoperable on a city street in perpetuity. So,
Or even if operable.
even if even if operable. So we have our ordinance incorporates the state code, the state statute, but our ordinance specifically talks about the fact that if it is left there for a period of 72 hours or more, then that triggers certain things that the city can do in order to ensure that that vehicle is moved from that location.
Okay. And I think, because this has come up both with my time when city attorney and the towns that I represent too, is it's not on the public street, it's in my own front yard. There, if it's an operable vehicle, can't do anything about it, absent having too many and become a junkyard, which goes into a whole nother scenario. But if it's inoperable and older than 3 years old and is there for more than 20 days, you can even tag it on the private property.
That's right.
Okay. A lot of this gets into the code enforcement. Talking about my neighbors or if somebody else sees me, can anybody enforce the code, or how does the enforcement of the code actually go about in practical terms?
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk in terms of practicality or pragmatism. So John Smith, that has a neighbor that has a problem, can't decide, well, I'm going to go enforce the city code and issue you a citation. It doesn't work that way.
Because it's not a civil matter between neighbor A versus neighbor B. All code violations are ultimately filed in the name of the city. Kind of like the prosecutor. I can't bring criminal charges against somebody. It's the state of Indiana that brings a criminal charge. Likewise, it's the city of Richmond that brings a code violation. Is that not true?
That is true. And so from a practical perspective, if John Smith calls my office and says, hey, this building is falling down, or there's trash and garbage all strewn about the front yard, that's something that would probably trigger some form of an investigation, or they're going to go out and look at this. And so practically, maybe that information
they can bring it to your
me.
attention.
Correct.
Bring it to your attention, try to get some enforcement to it, but as far as they can't file it, it would have to be you.
Correct.
Now, if one is cited for a code violation, what's the norm? What are the possibilities that would happen if I'm cited for a code violation?
So we recently created a new chief code enforcement officer or department head of that office. So this person would go out and determine whether or not there's a code violation. He could then issue that violation, and there would be a financial penalty associated with that. That eventually would be routed to the law department, and then we give that person a period of time, a window
To pay the fine.
Pay the fine.
That's the fine. Okay.
Right. If they don't, however, then I would make the determination that they haven't paid this fine, and then we proceed to file a complaint with the Wayne County Superior Court number 3 to seek a judgment, to collect on that. And there's some things that can happen as a result of that ends up costing you more money if you don't pay the fine initially.
And what are some very common violations, fines going on in your office?
I see a lot of exterior maintenance issues, and we kind of touched on that earlier. Parking issues. So if you're parked in a spot for longer than you should be, or you park in a handicap spot where you shouldn't be. Issues relative, and this is a big one, to garbage and rubbish. So if you are just allowing garbage to pile up in your front yard, well, obviously the city, for number one, health reasons, and number two, aesthetic reasons, has a vested interest in making sure that that gets cleaned up. So I would say those are 3 of the main areas.
While the city police have an ability and the authority to enforce state laws too, such as speeding, does the speeding violations actually go through your office, or that is more state law? So it's more the non-moving violations, the parking violations. Acute story, I remember when I was city attorney, and I'm sure you have some of these stories too, that we were enforcing some parking violations, and so the woman did not pay the fine, so of course we had to file the suit against her to enforce that. Met her outside the court, and she was a middle-aged woman and comes up with her young child and has her suitcase with her. And I asked her I said, "Ma'am, are you going somewhere?" She said, "I figured I would need that when I'm taken off to jail for this." It's probably not a jailable offense, is it, on the parking violation?
It would not be.
And she was so tickled when I said, "I think if we just get you to pay the fine, you're going to be okay. You don't have to kiss your son goodbye here." But people, I think, do have some misconceptions. Although then, as you and I have talked before the show too, there's the other extreme that thinks they can get away with anything at any point in time, and you're going to try to stop that thought process in town.
Yeah, that's certainly something that's on our radar. Unfortunately, we see that other end of the spectrum more often than we see the scenario that you just talked about. So we're trying to be consistent about enforcing these violations to make sure that people understand that there will be some financial penalty associated with not following these ordinances.
When we were talking about the skateboards too, I wanted to let people know that that also applies to roller skating. ATVs right now are not allowed on the streets. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Although there may be some movement.
There's some talk among council, it seems like.
The motorized scooters that we're seeing in the larger cities, promoted by Bird and other companies, they would have to get some law changed for them to be allowed in the street here in Richmond as well, wouldn't they?
They would.
How about the stuff that's in my house I just bought that I need to move out? Is there a way that I can contact the sanitation department or somebody else to help me get those things moved?
Yeah, there are procedures in place to do that. So we have container rentals within the sanitation department. You can rent a container that would hold up to 3 cubic yards for $80 per year. And so that's something you kind of see that sits outside of businesses on an ongoing basis. But you can also rent what we call, or commonly referred to as roll-offs. So you can have that delivered for a relatively nominal fee to dispose of that refuse.
It's like a $5, $10 fee.
Yeah, I think it's just a delivery drop-off fee of like $5.
And so then you can fill that with stuff, I think, other than there are certain things that are not allowed to be put in that.
Right.
But in general,
construction materials,
construction
roofing
material,
materials,
all that.
things like that.
But you could make your way to them to rent that and hopefully utilize that to have some of the stuff removed from your house.
Right.
Now, I know in my situation, it was a pre-existing house. If I'm building a new one and want to hook up to the sewer, it is a city sewer service. How do I go about that?
Well, you'd want to contact the sanitation department. The sanitary board is able by statute to make any rules and regulations it deems necessary for the safe, economical, and efficient management of the sewage utility in the way the statute reads and for the connection to the sewage system. The statute provides you can't do that first without obtaining the approval of the municipality and paying any fees that the municipality would assess for that tap. So any fees associated with the construction, labor, materials to do that, you get prior approval and agree to pay those fees. There's a process in place to allow you to tap into the sewer
In general,
system.
and I think it's your contractor that would have
be
to
a contractor,
go.
typically would.
Typically, it would be your contractor that would go and be able to do that. Okay, when I'm going out to the park, can I just go out and just get a bunch of people and we throw a party on Roosevelt Hill and drink some beer, shoot off some fireworks?
Yeah, that part is the most troubling of your example.
So you're giving this guy another no, aren't you, right now?
I don't even feel bad about the no in this scenario.
Okay.
So first, by ordinance, we don't allow alcoholic beverages into the parks except for a couple of limited scenarios. If you play golf and have been out to Highland Lake Golf Course, you know that they sell beer there. So that would be one exception. Additionally, at McBride Stadium is another place that they could do that.
I think during the old Roosters game or the other ball games there, they've had, on occasion, the ability to sell beer there. But absent those two exceptions, no alcohol in any city-owned park.
Correct.
Likewise, fireworks. I think that probably goes beyond even the parks, that you're not really supposed to be shooting them off anywhere in town.
Right. Yeah, you're not supposed to. So if we look at the ordinance, it says in Richmond you can't discharge any type of firework but for in the case of a public celebration that the mayor would approve. And in that instance, he would need to set conditions as he deems safe and proper. So stated differently, in your example, the guy's going to have to go to the mayor and try to convince him this is some form of a public celebration and that we have the conditions in place to make this safe and reasonable.
For the fireworks, yeah.
And I'd probably counsel the mayor against it in this situation with the beer and guns. Yeah.
But you might be able to still throw your party out. Now, you can't have the beer out there, and you're probably not going to be able to get permission to shoot the fireworks, but people get organized activities, rent a shelter house, rent something. But again, you go through that to have that kind of celebration, or even a demonstration. I noticed that was in the code, too, to have a public demonstration of sorts.
Right. So if you look at our ordinance, it talks about the fact that no one is permitted to hold any meeting or a ceremony in the parks unless a permit is obtained first from the Parks Board. The board would issue that permit unless the purpose is commercial in nature, the location isn't suitable for some reason. So in order to organize for those purposes, again, there's a permit process for that.
While we're at the parks, I also noticed no gambling in the parks. I noticed we have an ordinance on that.
Yeah, we do. So if you want to incorporate that into your party, I think we even talk about telling fortunes, having a slot machine, and those types of things. No, we have an ordinance that would prohibit your ability from doing that.
This may be a good time, too, to make sure people understand ordinance versus city code. They're kind of used interchangeably, but tell us, what is the actual process of ordinance versus a city code?
So our city code is what you and I went to look at as we were kind of dealing with the issues that you bring up in your example or your fact pattern scenario. And that's codified within the city to tell us the legislation done by council, things we can and we can't do. An ordinance, though, can be any piece of legislation that comes to council, and we have those at every single council meeting. So every other week we see those come to council, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a law that prohibits someone from drinking in this area or not doing this or that. It could be an appropriation ordinance that deals with a grant.
Right. I think that's what people, an ordinance is really anything that comes before city council, and those can be a specialized ordinance congratulating Richmond winning the state championship, or a financial ordinance, or if it's an ordinance that affects what controls our behavior in the town, then it's an ordinance that amends or modifies the current city code, which is a codification of all of those types of ordinances.
Right.
And so when someone says, I'm violating that ordinance, in effect, they're violating that part of the city code that got there through an original ordinance passed by city council.
Right. And again, that goes through that 3-reading process, and there's a public hearing opportunity, so all of the opportunity for people to come and speak, whether they're a proponent or object to that, is there for those people.
Okay. Going a little bit beyond my example, too, unless I'm going to also try to sell my pet supplies door to door on that new pet store that I'm opening up. Transient vendors. The city has some rules and regulations regarding someone selling door to door, don't they?
Yeah, again, and this is kind of consistent with the theme of what we're talking about tonight, but you have to secure a license from the city controller prior to engaging in that type of business within the city, and that license is valid for a period of 45 days. So I think you kind of touched on this, but we're talking about someone who sells or solicits goods to the general public by traveling from place to place, door to door, that sort of thing. So again, there's a license procedure in place in order to do that.
Okay. And I think the exceptions to that is if you are a charitable or not-for-profit trying to solicit there, you would not need it. But if you were actually trying to sell a commercial product, then you'd have to get this permit from the city ahead of time.
That's correct.
Would that not be correct?
It is.
We did not talk about the shooting of the gun, my firing range, my target range in my backyard. Can I put that in?
So we're not talking about shooting at the park anymore, we're in your backyard.
I am in my backyard.
Yeah, so as far as I am aware, we don't have any ordinances that would directly prohibit that. However, this is a big disclaimer here, if you are on South 15th Street on a small parcel of property and decide to discharge your firearm, my guess is that RPD will show up and you're going to have some issues with recklessly discharging a firearm, and there could be felonies associated with that.
I think if my memory serves me, at one time the city did have a complete blanket prohibition, no firing of firearms within the city limits. I think it was then later changed with some constitutional challenges, et cetera, that said now you just are not allowed to do it if it endangers safety. But again, we need to do a disclaimer that none of this is promoting legal advice to anyone, but just giving us some generalities.
Right.
And so always be able to check with a certain department in the city or your own legal counsel if you have questions about any of this. I would say you would agree that's the safest procedure.
Certainly agree with that.
Are there any other things you would like to share about the makeup of the city government and the different departments? If people have questions about anything we've talked about today, or
Yeah, so oftentimes I'll get questions about, well, why wasn't this done, or why didn't this person do that? But the city government, like any business, is broken out into different departments. So we have various departments. We've touched on I&D, infrastructure and development. We have human resources, the law department, RPD, the fire department. Each one of these departments has different issues that they're able to handle and decisions that they are able to make. And those are all a part of the executive branch, which is essentially the mayor. And then separate from that, we have the fiscal branch, which would be council. And so they function completely, or do different things than the departments that we're talking about. Obviously, there's some overlap between the two, but I think what is important for people to understand is that if you have an issue, let's boil it down to what it is in its simplest form, and then try to determine who would be the appropriate department head or department to take that issue to. There's not any one person that gets to wave the magic wand and say, I can do this for you right away. So that there is that procedure in place, and I think that's consistent with what we're talking about today.
Okay. And having said that, there's also then the other side of the equation that you, by being city attorney, that we're calling it now, does not mean you are the attorney for everyone that lives in the city.
There's another common misconception. So oftentimes I'll get phone calls that, hey, I have this going on, or I have this dispute with my neighbor. I need you to fix that right away. And if you need to file a complaint and get an injunction in court, I'm fine with that. Well, unfortunately, I can't help you in that regard. So my client is the city of Richmond. I advise the departments and the executive and council.
Okay. Well, it looks like our time is up. I'm sure we could go on for hours talking about the intricacies of city government, their rules and regulations, but I want to thank you, AJ, for the insightful information today. And I want to thank you, the viewers, for tuning in for us. But stay tuned for another episode of Legal Briefs. I'm Bob Bever, and on behalf of BBKCC attorneys, I want to thank you. Have a good day.
What is discussed on this program is meant to be for general information and educational purposes. It is not intended to be legal advice and should not be used for that purpose. If you have legal matters you need help with, then you need to seek the advice of an attorney.